This small discussion will be about the cultural changes that took place in Latin America as a result of colonization. So the colonial period in Latin America lasted from the 16th century, or the 1500s, through the early 19th century, or the early 1800s. So you read about the conquest and Hernan Cortez sailing from Cuba, marching into Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, in 1521. He had mercenaries and soldiers with him, and within a couple of months had conquered the city. So you can see by this map that the Aztec Empire was most of what is now the middle part of Mexico and down into parts of Central America. So you can see the red line represents the conquest, or the route that was taken by Cortez. Here's a drawing that shows the conquest of Mexico City, which, when it was Tenochtitlan, it was built by the Aztecs on a lake, and so there were causeways leading from the city out to across the lake. And you can see in this drawing the Spaniards on horseback coming into the city in their battles with the Aztecs. So one of the most important pieces of colonization is the change in culture. We have the Spaniards coming with a very different culture than the indigenous in Latin America. And one of the most important pieces of culture is religion. So with the Spanish conquistadors came the Catholic missionaries. So they set out to save the souls of the indigenous in Latin America. And in fact, the Catholic missionaries believed that the indigenous did have souls that they needed to save. And in fact, this was a debate that was taking place in Europe at the time after the Europeans had landed in the Bahamas, where Columbus landed. After they had met with indigenous, they debated whether these were actually people. Did they have a soul? Could they be saved? And the Catholic missionaries believed that they could. So they spent a good deal of time working with the indigenous, converting them to Catholicism to, quote, save their souls. Many indigenous did willingly convert because they believed that this Catholic God must be more powerful than their indigenous God, since the Spaniards were able to conquer their indigenous overlords. Some people, of course, did not convert because they believed that in their gods and wanted to maintain their religion. And then, of course, there were people who converted on the surface so that they wouldn't be punished by the Spaniards, but in private they continued their own religion. So here you see a drawing of Catholic missionaries, many of whom came with the idea of saving people, not with getting rich, which was the idea of most of the Spaniards who traveled to what we now call Latin America. Here's a drawing of Catholic missionaries baptizing an indigenous baby. So there were a couple of ways that the Catholic Church gained a lot of power in colonial Latin America. One of the ways was through opening schools. They controlled all education throughout Latin America. There weren't any public schools, there weren't any government schools. The schools were completely controlled by the Catholic Church. So it was a very effective way of influencing the minds of an entire population through educating their children. The other way that the Catholic Church gained power was through buying land. The church became very rich through tithing. The indigenous as well as the Spanish colonists were required to tithe to make offerings to the church. And with that money, the church bought land. They bought agricultural land. They bought land in the city. And many priests and bishops became very wealthy. So by the end of the colonial period, the Catholic Church is very, very powerful as the colonial government. And so in the 19th and 20th centuries, when we have independence in Latin America and a move toward new nations, we see a lot of fighting between the government, the new governments, and the Catholic Church. One of the things to keep in mind is to think about, was the spreading of Christianity or of other religions such as Islam, how important was that in colonization of these various parts of the world that you're reading about this week?